And my guest tonight is author, researcher, friend, Peter Levenda. And as we were putting the show together here and talking about this, there was only one consideration for tonight's show. We need to have the real story of Fatima. Not only from behind the scenes and that perspective, but its true impact throughout the world. What really happened? It's an interesting story. Peter has researched the event thoroughly, and he wrote about it in his book, Sinister Forces, and probably a couple of others too. And to be honest, he was the first and only person contacted for tonight's broadcast. And I'm being very serious here. I have interviewed Mr. Levenda many times over the years, and I've read all of his books. And the one thing that I appreciate most about his research is that he is always able to see and present things in an almost 3D point of view. Events that span decades are all connected with an endless string of personalities and facts, and revealed in such a way that we are left with only one conclusion: that the world is not what it seems. And tonight, in classic Levenda fashion, I might add, we're going to get to the bottom of that Fatima story. The other day, someone posted on Twitter, and I'm not making this up, you could probably go and find it. Somebody posted on Twitter that if there is ever a Connect the Dots Hall of Fame, Peter Levenda is a first-year inductee. Seriously, it was posted and it wasn't me. So we have to ask ourselves, what was Fatima? What really happened on May 13th, 1917, and continued through October 13th, 1917? These dates, May 13th and October 13th, these are key dates throughout history, and they kept repeating themselves. Was it religious? I don't know. Was it the imaginations of three young children just gone wild? Possibly. Was it a close encounter of the UFO kind? Certainly that's on the table. Was it dogma? Was it propaganda? Was it all of the above? Think about that for a second. Well, this is going to be one of those shows. So turn down the lights and get ready. It's going to be a classic coast-to-coast night. Let's do this. You can follow me right now on Twitter at JChurchRadio. Very simple. And you know the drill. I announce it every night. Twitter is always live to my left. Any questions or comments, post them. And if it's good, maybe your tweet will get read on the air. Again, as always, enjoy the bumper music tonight. I made sure that Nathan did not make any mistakes. Yeah, I posted that picture up on social media, me with my frustration with Nathan. But I think tonight he's got this bumper music dialed. So enjoy it. There's also a little bit of a theme. We'll see if you guys can figure that out. Looking forward to your comments. And later on, we're going to open up the phone. So we're going to take some questions with Mr. Levenda, and we'll also have some open lines. All right? I'm your host, Jimmy Church, and I'll be right back with my guest, Peter Levenda, the 100th anniversary of Fatima. Peter Levenda has researched material for his books for almost 30 years, visiting more than 40 countries and gaining access to temples, prisons, personally visited, by the way, military installations, and government documents. He is the author of Sinister Forces 1, 2, and 3, The Hitler Legacy, Rat Line, and the Tantric Temples. He has appeared in the TNT documentary Faces of Evil as an expert on Nazi history with special regard to occult and esoteric practices. He has also appeared on the History Channel special Nazi Prophecies. His most recent release is Secret Machines, Gods, Volume 1 of Gods, Man, and War with Tom DeLonge of Blink-182 and To the Stars Media. Tonight, we are going to go deep. We're going to discuss the 100th anniversary of Fatima, which occurred on May 13th, 1917, in a mountainous region at the center of Portugal, where the Mother of God appeared 6 times to 3 young children. And I would like to welcome back Peter Levenda. Peter, good evening, and thank you so much.
Good evening to you, Jimmy. Thank you for that introduction.
100 years. It's pretty crazy. And as we unfold this tonight, do we have any Fatima updates? Anything crazy happened in Portugal in the last day or so?
Well, I've been following it pretty closely. There's been a lot of streaming video out of Fatima. Of course, Pope Francis was there today. He flew into Lisbon and then over to Fatima specifically to begin the services and to officially canonize the two younger children of the three who witnessed these apparitions. The younger children died in a influenza epidemic, I believe, around 1920, so they were still quite young when they died. And he canonized them officially today before a crowd of estimated to be 500,000 people.
Yeah, I had read some different numbers about that the capacity was 600,000. And they said that it could actually push up to 1 million, and some of the shots were pretty incredible. But they
were astonishing.
Yeah, they didn't actually do a head count though, right? No. They actually estimated the crowd size for the square there in Fatima. That's where these estimates have come from. But it was definitely a pretty massive pilgrimage into Fatima.
Sure. So it was quite an astonishing mass, and of course the canonization was very, very brief. Basically, he read a short statement and said, at this moment, I'm officially recognizing the canonization of these two, of Saint Francisco and Saint Jacinta. And when he did that, everybody applauded in the square, and that was basically it as far as the canonization ritual is concerned. But the canonization process lasted for years before that. You can't canonize a saint unless there are miracles attached to that saint in some way. If there are no miracles, then there's no saint. And one of the cases that was presented, it was that of a young boy who had fallen out of a window in an apartment building and should have had severe brain damage after he hit the pavement, and it turned out he had absolutely no issues at all medically. So this was somehow connected, in a very long story, connected to the worship of Fatima and praying to the children of Fatima. And that was, I think, the key miracle that was given in defense of canonizing them. Normally in a canonization process, you also have what's called the devil's advocate, and that's somebody who tries very hard to find something wrong with the people that are being considered for canonization.
Right.
So these were two very small children, and the possibility they would have done something wrong, that would have, defiled them in the eyes of the church is very remote. And I think that really just never really came up.
Now, I want to start with today, and then we'll go back 100 years. But I think what's important to address is that the Vatican has not attempted to bury or hide Fatima. The Pope was there today. Now we've got two new saints as of today. So they are recognizing this as a real event today, aren't they?
Oh, sure. No, there's no question about it. You understand the way the Catholic Church is set up and the way that the situation is set up, they don't require Catholics to pray to Fatima, for instance, to Our Lady of Fatima or to the saints. It's there if they want to, and this has given the seal of approval, essentially saying these are real saints. In other words, should a Catholic go to heaven, they would meet these two saints there. I mean, these saints are canonized. They're part of the spiritual life in heaven as well as the church on earth. So, this is an official recognition of the event. This is as close as you're going to come to an official recognition. And the third person, the third child, Lucia, she only died a few years ago, about 10 years ago. So it's too soon for her to be canonized, although it's expected, of course, that she will be, because the two children already were. She will eventually be canonized as well. This will give basically the imprimatur on the whole thing. Fatima is considered real. Pope Francis considers it very real. I mean, he's been very involved with the Fatima thing for the last, since he was consecrated, since he was named the Pope. So he's been involved in it. John Paul II was very involved. Benedict was involved. All the popes going back to Pius XII were all very involved with Fatima for sure. So this was the one supernatural event that the Church actually seems to take to heart and to really believe in for whatever reason, and we can get into all of that, but this is really a central instance that the Pope would have gone that far to personally go to Fatima and canonize the two saints is telling you something.
And the other amazing thing about Fatima is that, and I know this is obvious, but it's a 20th century event. This is a modern event. It's been documented, the New York Times and photography and witnesses, and it's a 20th century event. This isn't 1,000 years old. This isn't 2,000 years old. This is modern history. And for you, and when you wrote about it in Sinister Forces, because you had access to 20th century information, was it easier for you to research it and get the facts?
Yes and no. I mean, it was just as easy and just as difficult as trying to research Operation Paperclip, for instance, or Watergate, since that's been in the news lately, and things like that. I mean, there's a lot of information, but getting to the real truth of the matter has proven a little difficult because you're dealing with the largest corporation in the world. You're dealing with the Catholic Church. And these are people who really do control the documentation, the paper trail on these things. They control the message to a great deal. If you're trying to pry open secrets concerning something like Fatima, you're running up against the Vatican. So in a way, yes, it's easy because it was covered so heavily back in 1917. As you say, there's photography about it. There are interviews. There's all sorts of media available on Fatima going back all the way to 1917 in various languages and from all over the world. People have been very interested in it. But getting to some of the other details about Fatima proves to be a little trickier.
Well, in my little introduction for you, and speaking about this, was it a real religious event? Was it the imagination of children? Was it a UFO encounter? Is it part of church dogma? It could be all of these things combined. And that's what's really interesting here, because when I had first read about Fatima as a young person, I remember the comments about it being a possible UFO sighting. And this is going back 30, 40 years ago when I had first read it. And this has been out there. It's been part of Fatima from the very beginning, and the reports that came out of 1917, the sun zigzagging down to the earth, is a pretty amazing thing to witness. And it appears that it actually happened.
Yeah, I mean, the UFO interpretation of it has certainly been around for that long at least. I've read a lot of reports that way that really goes and it was recorded at one point that on October 13th, which is when this fantastic, vision took place, that it was something like an aircraft. I mean, some people refer to it as an airplane or an aircraft, that they had seen, they had witnessed. This was the only words they could use to describe what was taking place. But it's important to know that the initial visions, the October 13th was the last of the six visions of 1917, but there had been visions in 1916, which were a little bit more suspicious, too, along those lines, because there's a ball of light, and then suddenly there's what today you might call a Nordic, a tall, blonde sort of alien figure coming out and talking to the children and saying that he is an angel of peace who's come down to earth, and he's sort of preparing the way for the six visions that are going to come later of the woman clothed in white who appears out of this halo of white light, or this ball or orb of white light, where she appears and talks to the children. But at no time, in the beginning visions, was any attempt made to connect this to the Virgin Mother of the Catholic Church's iconography. There was no, the children are simply reporting innocently what they experienced. And only later did it become really Catholicized into something that was in harmony and in concert with church ideas and church dogma of the period. So we lose something in the translation, you might say, since from that time until now, because there was this idea that you were witnessing a supernatural event, and especially in the earlier days, in the earlier visions, there was this idea that something was coming out of heaven and landing, and someone coming out and talking to the children. And then later, the October 13th, 1917 vision was the most startling. This is when you have a ball of light, it changes colors, it spins, it makes a noise. And some people reported hearing a humming sound or a buzzing sound,
right,
which is very familiar to UFO experiences, crashing to the ground and then rising straight up again. I mean, it's like a typical UFO sighting.
Now, what exactly happened on May 13th? I know that they were out grazing their sheep. They were sheep herders, these three kids. So what happened on that morning?
Well, that morning was the first of the 1917 sightings. And it's an unusual set of circumstances because the three kids, and they're small children, they're illiterate. They've never learned to read or write. They are Catholic, but at a time when the church is being oppressed in Portugal. So the churches are basically closed for the most part. There's been a great deal of government stress to sort of ban the church altogether. So the situation is extremely tense and extremely confused. And you have three little kids who really are not going to know very much about all of this in detail. They're not going to have the background, but they know what's happening to them. And a woman in white appears to them and starts talking to them. And she's talking about something called Russia, right? The kids, when they hear Russia, they think it's a girl's name, right? Because
right.
The lady is saying, you have to do something about Russia. We have to be careful. Russia is in danger. Russia must be consecrated to me, to her, to the woman in white. We have to do something about, taking care of Russia. This is in May of 1917, right? The Russian Revolution per se will not happen till November. It's called the October Revolution because of the calendar difference, but basically it happens in November of 1917.
Right.
But still, the months leading up to that are extremely dangerous in Russia. There's riots. There's civil war breaking out. There's all sorts of things happening. People are getting killed. It's the middle of World War I. There's just absolute chaos in that part of the world. But what's interesting to me is that the woman mentions Russia, doesn't say a word about Germany. Never does in the entire time. Catholic commentators have pointed out that she only talks about Russia. Her focus is completely on Russia. Through all the visions, through all the so-called the three secrets of Fatima, they are all concerned with Russia. Russia is the country that this vision, for some reason, whether it's the Virgin Mother, whether it's whatever supernatural occurrence it is tied somehow to a warning about Russia. So this is what they first see, what they first experience. And she says, I'll be coming back on this day every month for the next 6 months, the 5 months after. So May 13th is the first vision, then it's June 13th, July 13th, etc. Except in August, 1 month is on a different date because at this point the children have created so much interest and so much skepticism on the one hand, but also a lot of tension and anxiety on the part of the government because the last thing they want is a religious miracle when they're trying to stamp out the church. So they sequester the children somehow. They keep questioning them, trying to find out what it is they've actually seen because by now the church is getting involved. So the vision of August takes place, if I'm correct, August 19th instead of August 13th because the children were not where they were supposed to be. So quite conveniently, the vision takes place 6 days later.
Now, I'm going to jump in we have to take a break right here, but that's what's really interesting because the Portuguese church officials were doubting the whole story until, of course, everything happened on October 13th. Our guest tonight, Peter Levenda. It is the 100th anniversary of Fatima. The great researcher that we needed is with us tonight, and that is the one and only Peter Levenda. We're going to pick up where we left off right after this short break. Stay with us. I am your host, Jimmy Church. Our guest tonight, Peter Levenda. We're talking about the 100th anniversary of Fatima. Yes, it all began on May 13th, 1917. 3 children, sheep herders, are in Fatima, and they report that they see a vision of the Virgin Mary. Now, Peter and I were just discussing there was 6 visions that happened between May 13th and the big event that happened on October 13th, 1917. And the children had predicted that the Virgin would perform a miracle that day. And reports are up to 60,000 people were in Fatima to witness what they called the miracle of the sun, where the sun zigzagged across the sky, spinning towards the earth, and then took off in the opposite direction. Reports went into the media around the world, and at that point, Peter, is that when the church started to recognize that there was something really going on, and they were taking the children very, very serious at this point?
Well, yeah, I mean, there was no getting around it at that point. And the whole thing was mixed with religious politics and with secular politics, too. You have to understand that in a country where the church was being systematically suppressed, to have, I've seen numbers up to 70,000 people show up for basically a religious event, of course, was a threat. It was a threat to the government, the secular government in Portugal, because here were 70,000 people saying, we want to see this miracle, So this was a problem for the government, but also for the church. The church had to figure out how to handle this, because after the vision of May 13th, the very first of the 6 visions, a local parish priest sort of got involved. They were not supposed to talk about seeing the angel. They called her an angel, or the woman clothed in white on May 13th. But the word leaked out, of course. These were little kids, and they told their parents. And what happened was word spread, and they asked the parish priest, what should they do? And the priest says, well, let them. Let's see what happens. And he sort of opened the door for this. And because they went to the priest, and the priest is now interpreting what's going on in a very Christian Roman Catholic way. So now he's he's the spokesperson from him to the other priests and to the other clergy and to the local bishop. This is the guy who is now interpreting the events, right? So by the time it gets to October 13th, now a tremendous head of steam has been built up. And this particular vision takes place in October shortly, less than a month before the Russian Revolution breaks out and the Bolsheviks take over the country of Russia, and Bolshevism is basically an atheistic political ideology. So this was a tremendous direct threat to all religion, but specifically in Europe to Christianity. That's the way it was viewed. So this is all happening at that time. So the church now sees they got 70,000 people to show up for this,
right,
in a country which is becoming secularized officially by the government. So, wow, we better ride this train and not try to stop it, right? Because this is going to play in our favor. We don't know if this is real. We don't know what this is all about. But we had better be, on the bus or off the bus, right? We better be on the bus this time where this is concerned. The church has always been very reluctant to say this is a miracle, that's a miracle, or this sighting of the Blessed Virgin is real, or et cetera. They hold that sort of at arm's length for the most part. But in this context, in this environment, it was very, I think, useful for the church to have this going on. And who could accuse 3 innocent young children, of being, cynical manipulators of political propaganda, right, or anything like that? These are 3 innocent, illiterate children.
And the interesting,
saying they had these visions. What can you do? You can't say no.
Right. And the interesting thing here with these 3 illiterate children is the date of October 13th. How could they have known the significance of that date? Well, obviously they didn't. But what was October 13th?
My birthday, of course. How could they have known?
Yeah, how could they have known that?
But, no. October 13th, of course, is the famous date of the suppression of the Knights Templar.
Right. By
the Catholic Church, specifically, right? That was October 13th. That's where we get our Friday the 13th superstition from, most likely, because it happened on a Friday. So Friday, October 13th is a Catholic date of tremendous importance, but it's the date when the Church suppressed the Knights Templar. And the Knights Templar were, very faithful defenders of the faith. The only reason they were suppressed was because there was some political and economic stuff going on with the King of France and so on and so forth, and the Knights were becoming way too powerful and way too wealthy. So to get their hands on the gold, the church then suppressed the Knights Templar. So this could be a message, right? This could be a kind of a symbolic statement that this miracle happens on that specific day. Remember, this was decided in advance. On May 13th, the vision told the kids 6 more visions, ending on October 13th, right? I mean, this was planned from the beginning.
And the
They
church...
knew that they were going to finish it on October 13th. What is the message being sent? That we need the Templars back, that we need, the Crusaders now to come and defend the faith against the infidels. I mean, they're really infidels if they're atheists, right? They have no fides, they have no faith, so they are totally infidel. So you could see that this could be something the church could work with.
And the intrigue really starts to kick in here, doesn't it? The church must have been very, very aware about this October 13th date to see if a miracle or something would happen on this key date in church history. And, of course, it does.
Yeah, big time.
The reactions that went down and the aftermath of that, what happened to the children?
Well, of course, the children suddenly are becoming the focus of a lot of attention, but it is World War I, and Europe is falling apart. I mean, this was the war to end all wars, is how they described it, right? It was horrible. It was the first real mechanized war. You had the first tanks, and you had the first airplanes, and you had trench fighting, and it went on and on and on. It never seemed to end. So this was a terrible, terrible time for the continent of Europe. They were awash in blood because of this conflict. But there is more to it as well. The children themselves, of course, the older child, Lucia, went into a convent eventually, and she was the one who was really the one reporting the visions in some detail. The other two were not quite as eloquent or loquacious about what they had experienced. They were a bit more fearful about it, and they died very early on. In fact, one of the visions that they had received early on in those 6 visions was a prophecy that the 2 children would not live very long, that they were going to heaven very shortly. Only Lucia would be left. This was one of the prophecies that was made. And, of course, they did die. By 1920, the 2 children were both dead, and only Lucia survived, and she survived into the 21st century. So they're gone. And in a sense, having only Lucia, who knew the message, to be cynical about this, it actually worked in the church's favor. If they had all 3 kids and they started telling different stories, that would have been a little tricky, right?
Yes.
And the kids were sort of telling different stories because their experiences were a little different one to the other. They were not all on the same page as to what exactly happened and what exactly was said. So I'm not saying that the children were dispatched, by the church. All I'm saying is that, again, this kind of worked out in the church's favor. Had all 3 survived and they started claiming the other ones were not saying the right thing, Fatima would have fallen apart.
Well, and one thing that can't be denied here, Peter, all 3 were silenced. And that is very interesting. And I don't know if we're going to go into coincidences here or speak about being beyond coincidence, but for Francisco and Jacinta to, at a very, very young age, a year and a half after the events, they're dead. And Lucia, she's silenced because she's sent away to a convent and has become a nun, and she can't speak at all. Very convenient.
Yeah, absolutely. Because this event was tailor-made for the Catholic Church, and it would prove to be something that they would be using again and again and again throughout the 20th century. This became a very useful device for them, considering all the things that were going on in 1917. You also had, besides the Russian Revolution, this was the very beginning of the idea, if I may be so bold to bring this up, of global jihad. I mean, World War I was the time when Max von Oppenheim, he was an archaeologist, a German archaeologist, convinced the Kaiser to go to the Sultan of Turkey and tell that Sultan, which was, this was the Ottoman Empire, this was basically the first among equals among Muslims in that part of the world, to call for a global uprising of all Muslims against all of the foreigners, all of the non-Muslims, in a jihad, the first ever. Jihad normally doesn't work like that, but in this case, suddenly there was a global jihad. We're going to fight, the colonizers, the colonials, wherever we find them. Germany convinced Turkey to call for that jihad, and that was the beginning. That would turn into what happened with the Nazis during World War II and the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, and it would go on and on with the CIA in Afghanistan and everything else. All of these ideas all started in that war at that time. So the idea of weaponizing religion was really there in 1917 already. The idea that you can use religion as a kind of weapon against your enemies. This idea was percolating now. And Fatima kind of represents, that kind of mentality, that kind of thinking.
Now, we have the three secrets, secret 1, 2, and 3. Francisco and they're not in the picture, so there's no third or second or third interpretation of what these three secrets are. Right? It's just Lucia, and we start to move forward with this. What went public when, and who knew about the secrets besides Lucia at this point?
Well, the church fathers, the hierarchy, knew what the secrets were. The people that put her in the convent already knew what these secrets were. She had already discussed it with them, and they all. Like I say, they all somehow involved Russia to one extent or another. And the idea that you have to consecrate Russia, you have to pray for Russia, you have to reconvert Russia. This was a primary a motif in all of the secrets, right? The visions that she had from the Virgin Mother, as later she was called the Virgin Mother, all were talking about political events. I mean, everything seemed to be political with this particular set of visions. And the third secret, of course, is the one that was not supposed to be revealed either until 1960 or no later than 1960, according to Lucia. And that was the vision that is the big one. That's the ultimate third secret of Fatima, which is that a bishop dressed in white, which we consider to mean the Pope, is walking through up a mountain surrounded by death and destruction everywhere. There are dead bodies everywhere. And he walks up to the top of a mountain where there's a cross, and he and the people following him, part of this procession, other clergymen, lay people, other Christians, other Catholics, they're all mowed down by bullets and by arrows. They're massacred on the spot. And there are two angels standing next to the cross, and they have, in the Catholic Church, it's a spirulum. That's a kind of a basin with holy water in it. And that little wand they use to sprinkle people with the holy water. Well, they're using this filled with blood. And they're sprinkling blood upon the faithful so that they can enter heaven. So it's a very dire and disastrous type of vision. Very scary, full of death and destruction and blood and all sorts of horrible things. Horrible images for a young girl, to relate and to write down. And this was believed to be a prediction of the assassination attempt on John Paul II, which took place on May 13th, 1981. So it took place on Fatima Day. And there was an assassination attempt. The bullet did not kill him. Obviously, he survived it. And he took that bullet, the Pope later, and he went to Fatima and laid the bullet on the altar of the chapel in Fatima devoted to that vision. And he believed that he had been saved because of Fatima. And he made the statement at the time that he did not believe in such things as coincidences, that this was deliberate, it was the hand of fate, that the hand of the Divine Mother moved the bullet so he would not be killed.
You know what's interesting here, because he gave credit to his survival to Our Lady of Fatima and did return that bullet. But there are some other interpretations for secret number 3 that I've researched over the years, and one of them is a watered down, simplified version of the secret. But to me, and I think to most, had nothing to do with the Pope at all, which was it was a vision of conflict between clergy and the Vatican and soldiers, which goes back to that point that you made, right? They were mowed down, next to these two crosses. So I'm not so sure that the church and the Vatican has been straight with us over the years what that third secret actually is. How confident are you that we know the truth?
Well, we have, a copy of the secret in writing that's been published. Whether that's the entire secret or not, all we can do is go by what Lucia said. And Lucia said, yeah, that's the whole thing. Don't worry about it. But my problem with this is Lucia was, since 1917 until she died, and I think it was 2005, for all that entire time, she's deep within the bosom of the church.
Right.
She is, I don't call her a prisoner or a hostage, but in a sense, that's kind of what it's like. They were not going to let this woman leave the church. They were not going to let her leave the convent. They weren't going to let her wander around and say, I don't want to be a nun anymore. None of that's going to happen, right? So her freedom basically is curtailed. And they don't want her saying things to the public that haven't been vetted first by them. Anything that she's communicating has to go through channels. So, do we take at face value what Lucia said about the secrets? Or have they convinced her at some point, you have to play by our rules now because there's too much at stake. We've got Russia, it's the Soviet Union, we've got all these other things that are happening. My goodness, they tried to kill the Pope, right? All this stuff is going on. You can't go out there and start talking about this and just create more furor, more excitement, and more panic.
Right.
Let's just say this is it. That's the secret. Let's leave it at that and move on. And I think that's...
Yeah, and what's interesting here, Peter, that her being silent or, put away so she had no access to the media or to the public, probably not because she would contradict what was released, but maybe that she would reveal the actual truth about the secret itself. Do you think that that's probably what was concerning the church?
Well, yeah. In a sense, she's a loose cannon, right?
Right.
She actually is the one who had the visions. She's the one who saw what was going on. She's the one who talked to the Virgin Mother. She's the one who saw that angel of peace back in 1916 coming out of the whatever vehicle he was in. She saw all of that. People are going to believe her before they believe the Pope.
I'm going to jump in right here. We're going to take a quick break. Our guest tonight, Peter Levenda. It is the 100th anniversary of Fatima.